somewhere in the countryside of medieval Europe, it hardly matters which kingdom because this was true in nearly all of them, there is a bell ringing in the middle of the night. It is perhaps 2 o'clock in the morning. The village a mile away is perfectly dark. The farmhouses are dark. The manor is dark. The roads are empty. The fields are silver with frost. And every sensible person for miles in any direction is asleep, buried under wool and straw, waiting for the sun. And yet the bell rings. And inside the walls it belongs to, men are getting up. For most of 1,000 years, this was one of the strangest and most dependable facts of the medieval world, that in the deepest part of the night, past midnight, in the hours that belonged to owls and frost and nobody at all, there was one kind of community that rose on purpose, dressed, walked through the cold, and gathered to sing. Not once, as an exception, every night, in winter and summer, in plague years and famine years, in war and in peace, for century after century, tonight, we're going to spend one full day inside one of those communities, a monastery, somewhere in Europe around the year 1150. We'll follow it from this bell, in the dark, all the way around the clock until the next nightfall, when the whole house goes silent again. We'll move slowly. There is nothing to memorize, and no test at the end. Just one quiet day, lived the way tens of thousands of people actually lived it, hour by hour, bell by bell. And because the monastery's day was built out of bells, 8 of them, each with its own name and its own hour, we'll let those bells carry us. When one rings, we'll simply follow everyone else to wherever it says to go. The first bell is the strangest one. It's the one ringing now. The bell that wakes a man at 2 in the morning and asks him to sing. Chapter 1. Vigils, the bell in the dark. Begin with the room where the bell finds them. It is one long hall upstairs, above the warming room and the storerooms, the dormitory. It has a high wooden ceiling, small windows shuttered against the cold, and 2 rows of low, narrow beds running down its length. Perhaps 30 of them, perhaps 60, in a great house. There are no curtains between them, no private corners. The rule that governs this house is suspicious of private corners. A single oil lamp burns at each end of the hall, because the same rule says the monks should never sleep in total darkness. The light is small and warm, and it barely reaches the middle of the room. The men in the beds are sleeping in their clothes. That is not carelessness. It is the custom written into the rule itself. They sleep in their habits, the long wool robes they wear all day, with their belts on, so that when the bell rings they can rise without delay. The rule's author, a practical man, thought of everything. He even specified that they should not sleep with their knives at their belts, in case they cut themselves turning over in their dreams. So when the bell begins, a single bell struck slow and steady by the one monk whose job it was to stay half awake and watch the night, nobody in this room has to fumble for clothes in the dark. They sit up. They push back the wool blankets and the sheepskins. Some are old men who rise slowly, joints stiff with the cold. Some are boys of 15 who have to be touched on the shoulder twice. Nobody speaks. Speech stopped hours ago, at nightfall, and it will not begin again until morning. This is the great silence, and even the waking happens inside it. They form a line in the dark, and they walk, not out into the night, but down a staircase that exists in almost every one of these houses and almost nowhere else in the medieval world. The night stairs. A staircase built for exactly this moment, connecting the dormitory directly to the church, so that a community of half-asleep men can pass from their beds to their prayers without ever stepping outside into the frost. Generations of feet have worn the stone treads smooth. In some of these houses 800 years later, you can still see the dip in the middle of each step, polished by this exact nightly walk. The church at the bottom of the stairs is profoundly cold. It is the largest room any of them will ever stand in, and it is made entirely of stone, and no one has ever heated it. Their breath shows in the candlelight. The candles themselves are few and precious, beeswax if the house is rich, tallow if it is not, and they make small islands of gold in a darkness that goes all the way up into the roof, where the painted ceiling disappears as if the building simply continued into the night sky. They file into the choir stalls, 2 facing rows of high wooden seats, and they begin to sing. This is Vigils, the night office, the longest and slowest of all the day's prayers. Psalms, sung back and forth between the 2 rows of stalls, one side answering the other, the way the tide answers itself. On an ordinary winter night it goes on for well over an hour. The singing is not performance. Nobody is listening except themselves and, they believe, heaven. It is slow, unaccompanied, and pitched low, and men who have done it every night for 40 years can do it, truthfully, half asleep. There are accounts of old monks who could sing an entire psalm correctly while, by any reasonable definition, still dreaming. The rule takes a gentle view of this. Its author knew exactly what he was asking of human bodies at 2 in the morning. He asks the brothers to encourage one another as they rise, because, in his words, the sleepy like to make excuses. Why do it at all? Why build an entire way of life around being awake at the hour when the rest of the world has surrendered? They had their reasons, and the reasons are older than the monastery. A verse in the Psalms says, "At midnight I rise to give you thanks." Another says, "7 times a day I praise you." The men who founded these communities took both lines literally. 7 prayers in the day, and 1 rising in the night, 8 bells in all, and built the entire architecture of their lives, and eventually the actual architecture of their buildings, around a handful of sentences of poetry. There is something strangely human about that. 1,000 years of night stares, worn smooth because of a line in a song. But there was another reason, too, one they spoke of less directly. The night office was a kind of watchkeeping. The world outside was dark in a way we can barely imagine now. No lit windows, no lamps on the roads, nothing between the villages but black fields and the cold. In that world, the monastery was the one lit room. The monks understood themselves to be awake on behalf of everyone else, praying for the kingdom, for the dead, for the sleeping farmers who would never know. Whatever one believes about the theology, the image is hard to shake. The whole countryside asleep, and one stone building far out among the fields quietly singing to itself in the dark. The office ends. There is no announcement. The last psalm simply finishes, and the monks sit for a moment in the candlelight and the silence they have made. And then, this is the part that surprises everyone who learns it, they go back to bed. In winter, Vigils falls so deep in the night that when it ends, dawn is still hours away. So the line forms again, and the smooth stairs receive them again, and the dormitory takes them back, still in their habits under the wool and the sheepskins, with the 2 small lamps still burning at the ends of the hall. A monk in winter sleeps in 2 halves, one sleep on either side of the singing, and thinks nothing of it because he has never known another pattern. And by many accounts plenty of people beyond his walls broke the night the same way, into a first sleep, and a second with a quiet hour between them. Though how widespread that habit truly was is something historians still gently argue about. The dormitory settles. Someone coughs. The lamps flicker. Outside, the frost thickens on 60 acres of sleeping gardens and orchards and fish ponds, all of it waiting for the next bell. That bell will come at first light, and it has the loveliest name of the 8. Lauds, the praises, will rise for it in a moment, but for now let the house lie still. 30 men in a long dark room, sleeping their second sleep in the only building for miles with a lamp lit anywhere inside it. An interlude. The bells and the keeping of time. We have followed this entire day by 8 bells, but we haven't yet asked the obvious question, how exactly did anyone know when to ring them, in a world with no clocks in the sense we'd recognize the word? The bells themselves were substantial objects, cast in bronze, sometimes by traveling bell founders who set up a temporary furnace right on the monastery grounds for the job, pouring molten metal into a clay mold built around a wooden pattern, then breaking the mold away once it cooled to reveal the finished bell beneath. The large bell, hung in a wooden frame in a tower built specifically to hold its weight and let its sound carry, might weigh many hundreds of pounds, and represented a serious investment of the community's resources. But a bell, once cast correctly, could ring for centuries, its voice becoming as familiar to the surrounding countryside as any human one. Ringing it at the right moment, though, especially through the long, indifferentiated dark of a winter night, fell to careful, patient tracking rather than any single mechanical device. The responsibility usually belonged to the sacristan, an officer already tasked with the church's candles, vestments, and altar vessels, who added to that list the job of watching the night. In the simplest houses, this meant a monk staying awake, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead and learning, through long experience, roughly how far the night had progressed, by which constellations stood where. Some houses used a marked candle, burning at a known steady rate, with the hours scored into its wax like a ruler, so that a glance at how far it had burned down gave a rough but workable estimate of the time. A few of the wealthier or more technically ambitious houses maintained water clocks, a steady drip of water filling a marked vessel at a controlled rate, an old technology handed down from the ancient world, more reliable than a candle at holding a consistent pace through a long night. By day, a sundial mounted on an outer wall did the simpler work whenever the sky cooperated. On the clouded, snow-heavy days that dominate a northern winter, though, even that failed, and the community fell back once more on practiced habit and careful attention. Men who had lived this same rhythm for decades, developing an internal sense of the hours that needed no device at all. What all of this points toward is a fact that hides in plain sight. Keeping this day on schedule, hour after hour, night after night for centuries, was itself a quiet, constant labor, invisible in the finished result. Nobody in the dormitory tonight will think about the sacristan's careful watch, the marked candle burning low in its holder, or the bell founder who cast the bronze 100 years before any of them were born. They will simply hear the bell and rise, the way their brothers have risen at that exact sound for longer than anyone currently alive can remember. Chapter 2. Lauds, the praises at first light. The second bell comes gently, the way morning itself comes gently in winter, not a sudden thing, but a slow gray seeping in at the edges of the shutters. By the time it rings, the sky outside the dormitory has already begun its long, reluctant lightening, though the sun itself is still an hour or more from actually appearing over the fields. This is Lauds, and its name means exactly what it sounds like: praises. Of all 8 hours of the day, it is the one built specifically around sunrise, and the psalms chosen for it lean toward light, verses about the morning star, about darkness giving way, about the world waking up. Whoever arranged this office centuries ago understood something simple and durable, that there is a particular kind of relief in watching night end, and that relief deserves its own hour of singing. The walk down the night stairs is the same walk as before, but the church at the bottom has changed. The candles are still lit because true daylight hasn't arrived yet, but the tall windows along the east wall have begun to hold a color, not yet blue, not yet gold, just the faint promise of both. By the time the office reaches its final psalm, that promise will usually have been kept, and the first real sunlight, thin and orange, will be lying in long stripes across the stone floor. There is a practical reason Lauds matters as much as it does beyond the beauty of the hour. Once it ends, the day, the working day, the daylight day that anyone outside these walls would recognize as a normal life, actually begins. The monks file out of the church, not back up the night stairs, but out into the cloister, a covered walkway built in a square around an open garden, connecting the church to every other important room in the complex. It is here, walking the cold stone arcade with the frost still on the garden grass beside them, that the community gets its first proper look at the day's weather: clear sky or snow clouds, still air or a hard wind off the hills. It will matter enormously in a few hours, when the work of the morning is decided. First, though, there is washing. Near the entrance to the refectory, the dining hall, stands a long stone trough called a lavatorium, fed by a channel of running water diverted in the better planned houses straight from a nearby stream. In deep winter that water is agony, genuinely, physically painful, cold enough to make hands ache within seconds. The monks wash anyway, quickly, because cleanliness before the day's first prayers and first bread is simply expected, not because anyone enjoys it. There are, in a few surviving accounts, complaints about this exact trough, in this exact season. One of the small human details that survive from lives otherwise recorded mostly in Latin formality. Bread comes next, though not a meal in the way we would recognize one. In many houses this is little more than a heel of bread, and perhaps a cup of watered wine or small beer, eaten standing or not eaten at all if the house observes a stricter tradition of fasting until midday. It exists mainly to give the body enough to survive several more hours of prayer and labor, not to satisfy it. Real food, the one substantial meal of a winter day, is still many hours away. And now, in the pale new light of a winter morning, with the frost only beginning to soften on the cloister garden, the community has its first true choice of the day: what work needs doing. That choice belongs to the next bell, not this one. But it is already on everyone's mind as Lauds ends, the way a person half listens to their own thoughts about the day ahead even while still doing something else entirely. For now, though, there is a pause. A brief, unstructured stretch of the early morning, sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes closer to an hour, depending on the house and the season, when nothing in particular is demanded. Some monks use it for private silent prayer in a quiet corner of the church. Some simply stand in the cloister and watch the light change on the garden, hands tucked into their sleeves against the cold, waiting, like everyone else in this story, for the next bell. Chapter 3. Prime and the Chapter House. The day is assigned. The bell for Prime is a short one, almost businesslike compared to the long night singing of Vigils. It calls the community to one final brief office, a handful of psalms, quickly done, and then immediately afterward, somewhere every member of the house has to go, whether they want to or not. The Chapter House. It is a plain stone room, usually attached to the cloister on its eastern side, with stone benches running along the walls, and at the far end a raised seat for the abbot, the head of the house, elected by the community itself, and answerable, in the medieval imagination, directly to God for every soul in his care. The monks file in and take their places by seniority, the oldest nearest the abbot, the newest arrivals nearest the door, and the day's actual business begins. First, a short reading, a chapter literally, of the rule that governs their lives. The same document, read start to finish and then started again, year after year, so that by the time a monk has lived in the house for a decade he can likely recite long passages of it from memory, without ever having tried to. This is where the room gets its name. The chapter of the rule, read each morning, gave the chapter house its title and gave the daily community meeting its name as well. A chapter, in the sense we still use for a section of a book, and a chapter in the sense of a formal gathering, are in fact the same word, for exactly this reason. After the reading comes the part of the morning that new arrivals dread most and old hands have long since made peace with. The chapter of faults. One by one, or by invitation, monks confess small failings in front of the entire community, arriving late to an office, speaking during the great silence, neglecting an assigned task, showing impatience with a brother. This is not the dramatic confession of serious sin. It is something almost domestic in scale, closer to a household correcting its own small frictions in the open rather than letting them fester unspoken. Corrections are given, sometimes penances, an extra set of psalms, a period of humbler work, occasionally a period of silence at meals beyond the usual, and then, in principle at least, the matter is closed, forgiven, and not raised again. There is something almost startlingly modern about the theory behind it, whatever one makes of the practice. A community that has agreed, formally, to name its small failures out loud rather than let resentment accumulate in silence. Whether it always worked exactly as intended is, of course, a separate question. Surviving letters and later reforms suggest that old grudges could outlive their official forgiveness just as easily inside these walls as anywhere else. But the structure itself, repeated every single morning for 1,000 years across thousands of houses, remains one of the strangest and most far-sighted inventions of monastic life. Then, finally, the business of the day. Work is assigned. The obedientiaries, the officers of the house, each responsible for one domain, step forward. The cellarer, in charge of food and supplies, the infirmarian, in charge of the sick, the precentor, in charge of the books and the music, the novice master, in charge of the young men still training for full membership. Each reports briefly on what the day requires, and the abbot, or the prior beneath him, assigns the community accordingly. So many hands to the gardens, so many to the mill, so many to the scriptorium, so many to whatever urgent repair or harvest or building project the season demands. By the time the chapter house empties, every man in the community knows exactly where he is expected to be for the next several hours. and the day, which has so far been entirely about prayer and cold water and confession, turns, at last, toward labor, an interlude, the novices. Somewhere in this community, among the men we've been following through Vigils and Lauds, and the cold walk down the night stairs, there is a smaller, quieter group living a slightly different version of the same day, because not everyone in this dormitory has taken permanent vows yet, and the path to this life, for almost everyone who ever walked it, began with a long period of simply being tested. By the 12th century, in most houses, the picture had shifted a good deal from earlier centuries. In the very early medieval period, it was common for families to offer young children to a monastery outright, a practice called oblation, a boy handed over at 7 or 8 years old to be raised entirely within the walls, with no real memory of any other life. By the time of the day we're following here, that custom was fading in most regions, discouraged by reformers who worried, reasonably, that a childhood spent this way produced monks who had never actually chosen the life at all. Increasingly, the men arriving at the gate were older, teenagers, young adults, sometimes men well into their 30s or 40s, who had lived an entire other life first, as soldiers, merchants, widowers, before arriving here. Whatever their age, none of them were let in easily. The rule that governs this house is explicit and almost suspicious on this point. Do not grant newcomers an easy entrance, it says, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. A man presenting himself at the gate might be made to wait outside for days before anyone even spoke to him, and once admitted, he entered not the community itself, but a kind of holding pattern beside it. The novitiate typically lasting about a year, sometimes longer. The novices slept apart, in their own smaller dormitory or a curtained section of the main one, under the direct supervision of one senior monk given the specific responsibility of watching over them. The novice master, his task was not simply religious instruction, though there was plenty of that. A novice arriving from the ordinary medieval world usually could not read Latin. The language, every single office, every prayer, every book in that cold scriptorium was written in. So the days held lessons alongside the labor, learning to read, learning the Psalter well enough to sing it from memory, learning the rule itself line by line, and learning patiently the whole silent vocabulary of hand signs that let the rest of the community eat a meal without a word. It was not, by design, a gentle year. The novice master's job included watching closely for whether a man's enthusiasm was genuine or simply the passing excitement of a difficult season in his outside life. A bad harvest, a broken marriage, a debt he couldn't pay, any of which might send a desperate man toward the monastery gate for reasons that would not survive real winter. The rule allows for this bluntly. If he still stands firm, it says, after some difficulty and rejection, only then let him be admitted. A novice who wished to leave in the first year generally could, without shame attached. The door swung both ways, deliberately, because a rule this demanding had no use for men who hadn't fully chosen it. Those who stayed the full novitiate faced at its end a formal and permanent commitment, vows of stability, meaning this house and no other for the rest of his life. Obedience to the abbot and the rule, and what the tradition calls conversion of life, a promise to keep striving toward the community's way of living, imperfectly but sincerely, until death. From that day forward, the man who had arrived at the gate a stranger became, in every practical sense, indistinguishable from the monks who had been singing these same psalms for 40 years. He took his place in the choir stalls by seniority of profession, not age, and began adding his own decades to a chain of nightly singing that, in some of these houses, already stretched back 300 or 400 years before he ever arrived, and would continue, in fact, for several hundred more after he was gone. An interlude. The abbot and the governing of the house. We've mentioned him already, seated at the far end of the chapter house each morning, but what kind of authority he actually held deserves a closer look, because it was unlike almost anything else in the medieval world's usual arrangements of power. He was, first of all, elected, chosen by the community itself, the monks casting their voices for one of their own number to lead them, a genuinely unusual thing in a wider society built almost entirely around inherited titles and appointed offices. The rule describes the office in language that is deliberately, insistently pastoral rather than simply administrative. The abbot is to be called Father, and is told repeatedly that he will answer to God on the day of judgment for every soul placed in his care, as surely as for his own. It is a heavy way to describe a job, and the men who held it seem, by the evidence of their own writings, to have felt the weight of it. In practice, his authority touched nearly everything. He assigned work, as we saw at chapter each morning, through the obedientiaries who reported to him. The cellarer managing food and supplies, the infirmarian managing the sick, the precentor managing the books and the music of the choir, the novice master managing the men still being tested. He heard confessions of fault, set penances, settled disputes between brothers, and held final say over the community's finances, its land, and its relationships with the bishops and nobles and kings who existed, sometimes uneasily, just beyond the monastery walls. That last part mattered more than it might seem. A large, well-endowed abbey was not merely a religious house. It was often one of the wealthiest landholders for many miles around, controlling farms, mills, and villages of tenant farmers who owed the monastery rent and labor the same way they might owe a secular lord. Some abbots, particularly at the grandest houses, held a kind of standing barely distinguishable from the nobility itself, summoned to royal councils, consulted on matters of state, occasionally even expected to provide knights for a king's army. From among the abbey's own tenants, it is a strange, layered picture. A man elected by his brothers for his holiness, who might spend his morning in the chapter house discussing a monk's small failure to rise promptly for vigils, and his afternoon corresponding with a bishop or a count about a boundary dispute worth a small fortune in land. Because of this, the abbot's own daily rhythm often drifted slightly apart from the community's. He kept his own separate lodging in many houses, sometimes ate with important guests rather than at the common table in the refectory, and carried responsibilities that could pull him away from the monastery entirely for weeks at a time, traveling to defend the house's interests or attend to business the wider church required of him. The rule anticipated even this gently. Whatever he assigns or orders, it says, should be reasonable, and the strong should have something to strive for while the weak are not overburdened. An instruction, in effect, to lead with judgment rather than simply with authority. It was not, by any means, a perfect system. Surviving records from across medieval Europe include plenty of abbots remembered for pettiness, for favoritism, for losing themselves entirely in the secular business of running an estate and neglecting the pastoral half of the title. But the office itself, elected, answerable to the community that chose him, bound by a written rule older and more permanent than any individual holding the post, was, on its better days, a genuinely thoughtful answer to an old and difficult question. How do you give one person authority over many others, and still keep that authority honest? An interlude. The habit and the wardrobe. Every monk in this story has been dressed all day in the same thing we glimpsed first in the dark of the dormitory. The habit, a long loose robe of undyed or dark-dyed wool, belted at the waist, with a deep hood attached, for the coldest hours. It earns a closer look because the rule spends real, careful attention on clothing, not out of vanity, which it explicitly rejects, but out of the same practical concern that shapes almost everything else in this life. The rule specifies that each monk should have 2 tunics and 2 cowls, one set for use, one for washing or mending, so that no one is ever left without something to wear while the other is being cleaned. A cowl for winter, thicker, and a lighter one for summer if the climate allows the distinction. Shoes and stockings for outdoor work, sandals for indoors. Nothing elaborate, nothing colored beyond whatever the undyed wool or a simple black dye naturally offered, because the whole point of the garment was to stop announcing anything about the man wearing it. No house crest, no sign of the wealth or poverty he'd arrived with, just the same plain cloth as every other man in the choir stalls. Responsibility for keeping the community clothed fell to an officer sometimes called the wardrober, who tracked the wool, arranged for its spinning and weaving, either by lay workers on the monastery's own land or by purchase from nearby weavers, and saw to the actual sewing and mending. Worn habits were patched rather than replaced, for as long as patching held. The rule again warns explicitly against anything resembling extravagance, and a monk known for demanding fine or excessive clothing invited exactly the kind of gentle correction dealt out each morning at chapter. There was one more piece of the monk's appearance we haven't mentioned, though every single man in this story carries it. The tonsure, a distinctive haircut, the crown of the head shaved bare in a circle, while a ring of hair remained around it, evoking in its symbolism a crown of thorns. Maintaining it required regular shaving, a task usually handled by one brother skilled with a blade, and it marked a monk instantly, at a glance, from any distance to anyone he encountered, inside the walls, or on the rare occasions he traveled beyond them, in the wider world too. The man could shed the habit temporarily. The tonsure took weeks to grow out. It was the most permanent uniform of all. Chapter 4, Terce and the Work of Hands. The bell for terce is brief again, a short office quickly sung, almost a formality wedged between the chapter meeting and the real work of the morning, and then the community disperses across the grounds, and for the first time since the middle of the night, the monastery stops being one single gathered body and becomes many small ones, scattered. This dispersal is the least understood part of monastic life by people who only know the word monk from images of robed men silently praying. For a large stretch of nearly every day, a medieval monastery was closer to a self-sufficient working village than a chapel. There is a phrase attributed to the rule's own spirit, if not its exact wording, that later generations distilled into two words, ora et labora, pray and work. The rule itself is explicit that idleness is the enemy of the soul, and that the brothers should therefore be occupied at set times in manual labor, and at other set times in sacred reading. So, the gardens. The large monastery in good land might have several: a kitchen garden for vegetables, an orchard, a herb garden for medicine, sometimes vineyards on a favorable slope. In winter there is less growing to tend, but there is always pruning, always turning frozen soil, always mending the low walls and fences that keep out deer and rabbits. The monks who work here know this land more intimately than almost anyone else in the region. The same hands return to the same rows year after year, decade after decade, and the garden's whole rhythm becomes as familiar as the Psalms. The mill, if the house has a stream strong enough to turn one, runs almost constantly, grinding the grain that becomes the community's bread, and often grinding grain for the surrounding villages too, in exchange for a portion of the flour, which was one of the ways a monastery quietly became one of the wealthiest and most important institutions for miles in any direction. The monks assigned here spend their morning among wooden gears and stone grinding wheels, dust in the cold air, the water wheel outside turning steadily whether anyone watches it or not. The fish ponds, carefully engineered chains of small dammed pools, common wherever the land allowed them, exist because the rule and the wider medieval church restricted meat from four-legged animals for much of the year, and fish became, by necessity and then by habit, one of the most valuable foods a self-sufficient house could produce for itself. Monks in low boots wade the shallow winter margins, checking nets, breaking thin ice where it has formed overnight. And the brewery. This detail surprises people every time they learn it, though it shouldn't. Monasteries across medieval Europe were among the most important brewers on the continent, producing beer not as an indulgence, but as a genuinely safer alternative to often questionable water, and as a reliable source of calories through the leanest months of the year. The monks who work the brewery understand malting and fermentation with a precision that would not look out of place in a much later century, refined over generations of trial, failure, and careful record-keeping, because everything in this community eventually gets written down. Not every hand is outdoors, though. Somewhere in the complex, usually along a sheltered side of the cloister where the light is best, Other monks are already bent over a very different kind of work. One will follow more closely soon, once the sun has climbed high enough to make it possible at all. For now, it's enough to know it's happening. Quills, ink, and blank vellum, waiting. The gardens go on. The mill turns. The fish ponds hold their winter stillness, broken only by the crack of thin ice. And somewhere above it all, the next bell is already being counted down toward, though no one working these frozen rows has any way of hearing it coming. An interlude. The cellarer and the kitchen. Of all the officers who report to the abbot each morning in the chapter house, one holds a rank the rule itself takes unusual care to describe in language warmer than almost anything else in that famously austere document. Let him be as a father to the whole community. This is the cellarer, and his responsibility, feeding, provisioning, and physically sustaining every single person inside these walls, for every day of every year, without fail, makes him, in practical terms, one of the 2 or 3 most important men in the entire house, whatever his rank in the choir stalls might otherwise suggest. His day begins, in truth, long before any bell most of the community hears, while the dormitory still sleeps its second sleep after vigils. The cellarer is often already awake, walking the storerooms with a lamp, doing the quiet arithmetic that keeps 60 or 80 people fed through a winter, with no way of simply buying more food if the calculation comes up short. There is no market open on a February morning with grain to spare. What sits in these rooms right now is all there is until spring. The storerooms themselves are a small world of their own, built into the ground floor beneath or beside the refectory, thick-walled and windowless where possible, to hold a steady cool temperature through every season. Grain fills the largest space, wheat and rye for bread, barley destined mostly for the brewery, oats for whatever animals the house keeps. It arrives at harvest in enormous quantity, more than the eye easily believes a granary could need, because it has to last a full year, through a summer of lighter stores and a long winter of heavy demand, with a careful margin held back always against the certainty that some harvest in some future year will fail outright. Beside the grain, barrels of salted and smoked fish pulled from the community's own ponds and preserved through methods refined over generations, packed in layers of salt that will keep them edible for months, wheels of cheese made from the milk of whatever sheep or cattle the monastery's own farms support, aging on wooden shelves in the coolest corner of the cellar, casks of wine, if the land and climate allow a vineyard, or barrels of the brewery's beer if it doesn't, both measured out with real precision, because the rule permits a set daily allowance, and no more, and it falls to the cellarer to make sure that allowance is honored without either stinginess or waste, a balance the rule itself worries over directly. Let him not be a great eater, it says of this officer, but let all things be done with moderation, and according to the abbot's instruction. Waste, in fact, is the sin the rule seems most anxious about in this particular office. Let him regard all the utensils of the monastery, it warns, as sacred vessels of the altar. A striking comparison, elevating a wooden bowl or an iron cooking pot to something close to holy, simply because it belongs to the shared life of the community, and treating carelessness with it as a genuine, if minor, moral failing rather than a trivial accident. In a world with no easy way to replace a broken tool or a spoiled barrel of grain before the next harvest, this was not excessive piety. It was survival, dressed in the language of reverence. The kitchen itself, just beyond the storerooms, runs on a rotation rather than a permanent staff. Each week, by long custom, a small group of monks takes on kitchen duty, the weekly servers, as the rule calls them, cooking, serving, and washing the vessels for the entire community's one substantial meal, on top of their usual round of prayer and other labor. It is not glamorous work, and the rule seems to know it, offering the weekly servers a small, specific kindness in exchange, an extra measure of food and drink before the community's main meal, so that they can serve their brothers, it says, without grumbling or undue fatigue. Even here, in the most practical corner of monastic life, there is the same underlying instinct we've seen all day. a rule written by someone who understood with real precision exactly how much a tired, hungry man's patience could be stretched before it broke, and who built in small corrections before that point arrived. By the time the community gathers for none and the single winter meal, none of them will think consciously about the arithmetic that made it possible. The Cellarer's early rounds with his lamp, the careful margins held back at every harvest, the salted fish and aging cheese and rationed wine, all of it converging invisibly into the plain meal in front of them. It is the least noticed and most essential labor of the entire day, and it never once stops for a bell, an interlude, the village beyond the walls. Step for a moment outside the monastery's gate and follow the road that leads away from it toward the cluster of houses visible on the horizon. Because for everyone living in that village, and in the scattered farms beyond it, this monastery is not simply a place of prayer somewhere nearby. It is their landlord, their employer, their court, their mill, and very often the largest single fact in their entire economic life. Much of the land surrounding a well-established abbey belonged, quite literally, to the monastery itself, farmed not by the monks but by tenant families who had worked these same fields for generations, paying rent not usually in coin, which was scarce in the countryside, but in kind, a portion of the harvest, a set number of eggs or chickens each season, days of labor owed on the monastery's own land at planting and harvest time, a farmer's whole yearly rhythm bent around these obligations as surely as the monk's day bent around their bells, though his bell, in a sense, was the harvest calendar itself. The mill we visited earlier, grinding the monastery's own grain, ground the village's grain too, and by long-standing custom in many regions, it ground almost everyone's. Tenants were frequently required by the terms of their tenancy to bring their grain to the Lord's mill and nowhere else, paying a portion of the flour called multure for the privilege. It was not, from the farmer's side, always a popular arrangement, and complaints about grasping millers and unfair measures survive in scattered records across the medieval centuries, but it was reliable, and it meant the monastery's water-powered mill, turning steadily through every season, sat at the literal center of the whole region's food supply, not just its own. Not every worker on monastery land was a farmer either, or even, technically, an outsider to the community. Many houses maintained a class of workers called lay brothers, conversi in the Latin, men who had joined the monastic life and lived under many of its disciplines, its silence, its rhythm of prayer, but who were not full choir monks, did not sing the full round of Latin offices, and were instead assigned primarily to the heavier manual labor the community's farms and workshops demanded, shepherding flocks that might number in the thousands, working distant granges or grange farms, sometimes a full day's walk from the main monastery, tending the herds and fields that fed the whole enterprise. In regions with the right land for it, this labor built entire regional wool economies, with certain abbeys becoming, over generations, among the largest wool producers on the continent, their fleece shipped out to distant markets and cities that most of the monks themselves would never see in their lives. Near the monastery's main gate, meanwhile, another figure managed a very different kind of exchange. The almoner, an officer whose entire responsibility was charity. Leftover food from the kitchens, worn but usable clothing, small amounts of coin when the treasury allowed it. All of it distributed by custom and by the rule's own insistence on hospitality, to the poor and the traveling who gathered at the gate on any given day. In hard years, a bad harvest or a hungry winter across the wider countryside, the monastery's stores, carefully husbanded by the cellarer we just watched at work, might be one of the only reliable sources of food for miles, and the line at the almoner's door could stretch long before dawn. And on certain days of the year, this same quiet countryside transformed entirely, because a number of abbeys held, by royal or church charter, the formal right to host a fair or market on their own land, bringing merchants, buyers, and travelers from well beyond the immediate village, filling the fields outside the walls with tents and noise and trade for a few days at a stretch, before the crowds dispersed again, and the monastery settled back into its ordinary rhythm of bells and silence. None of this, the rents, the mill, the wool trade, The almoner's line at the gate is visible from inside the church during Vespers, where the golden light falls quietly across the stone floor and nobody is thinking about grain rents or wool prices. But it is that entire surrounding economy, patiently managed across the same centuries as the singing, that made the golden light possible at all. Someone, somewhere beyond these walls, grew the grain, tended the sheep, and paid the rent that let this small, self-contained world of bells and silence go on existing season after season, largely undisturbed by the noisier world just beyond its gate. An interlude. The porter at the gate, every person and every piece of news that has entered this story from outside, the traveler in the guest house, the letters in the parlor, the poor gathered for the almoner's distribution, passed first through one man, stationed at one place, the porter, keeper of the monastery's gate. The rule gives this office a full chapter of its own, and the portrait it draws is precise and rather touching. The porter should be a wise old man, it says, old enough that he won't be tempted to wander, wise enough to know how to receive a message and return an answer. His lodging should be right beside the gate itself, so that anyone arriving always finds someone there to answer them. And his manner is prescribed down to the actual words. When anyone knocks, or a poor man calls out, he is to answer, "Thanks be to God," or "Your blessing, please," greeting the interruption, whoever it is, whatever the hour, as a gift rather than a nuisance. That small instruction is more radical than it sounds. The gate was the one place where the monastery's enclosure met the entire unpredictable world. Beggars and bishops, merchants and messengers, the genuinely desperate and the merely curious, arriving in no particular order and at no convenient time. The rule's answer to all of it was a standing policy of welcome, administered by a man chosen specifically for the patience the job demanded. The porter turned no one away without a hearing. The poor received alms at his door. Travelers were directed to the guest house. Tradesmen and their deliveries were passed through to the Cellarer, and anyone with no legitimate business was, presumably, managed with the same unhurried courtesy the rule asked of him in every other case. He also functioned, in practice, as the community's filter, the man who decided what interruption actually needed to travel further into the enclosure, and what could be handled at the threshold. A message for the abbot went inward. A request for bread did not need to. In a life built so carefully around the exclusion of noise and disruption, the porter was the mechanism that made the quiet possible. One wise old man, sitting in a small room by the door, absorbing the world's interruptions all day long so that 60 other men a few hundred feet away could keep their attention undisturbed on the psalm in front of them. There is something fitting in the fact that the rule ends its chapter on him, and very nearly ends the whole document there, before closing. The last person in the monastery's long chain of order, standing at its outermost edge, is not a guard, but a greeter, instructed to meet whatever arrives out of the dark with thanks. An interlude. The animals of the Abbey. No self-sufficient community of this size functioned on human labor alone. And scattered through every hour of this day, mostly unremarked, are the animals that made so much of it possible at all. Oxen, and in wealthier houses, horses pulled the plows through the monastery's own fields each season, and hauled the carts that moved grain from field to granary, stone from quarry to building site, wool from shearing shed to the merchant who'd eventually carry it to market. Their care fell to monks or lay brothers, assigned specifically to the stables, a physical, demanding responsibility that ran on its own schedule of feeding and grooming, largely independent of the community's bells, because an ox does not know or care that Sext has just been sung. Sheep, where the land-supported flocks might number in the hundreds, or at the largest wool-producing houses, the thousands tended on distant grange farms by lay brothers who sometimes lived apart from the main monastery, for weeks or months at a stretch, following the flock through its own seasonal round of lambing, shearing, and grazing. And then, in a detail that never fails to charm people encountering it for the first time, there were cats, kept deliberately and valued genuinely, for one specific and essential purpose: protecting the grain stores, and just as importantly, the library and scriptorium's precious vellum and manuscripts from mice, whose appetite for both grain and old parchment posed a real and constant threat. A cat earning its keep this way was no mere pet, though the affection was often real too. One of the loveliest survivals of the entire medieval period is a short poem, written in the margin of a manuscript by an anonymous Irish monk working far from here, addressed entirely to his own cat, comparing their two nightly occupations with unmistakable warmth. He hunts mice, the poem says, in something very like these words, and I hunt words, each of us happy in our own small work. Centuries later, that one small private joke between a bored or delighted scribe and the cat curled somewhere nearby is still being read, still making people smile, in a way its author could never have anticipated when he scratched it into the margin on some ordinary afternoon much like this one. Dogs, too, had their place, guarding the grounds at night, accompanying the almoner or the cellarer on rounds beyond the walls, sometimes simply tolerated presences around the kitchen and stables rather than formally assigned any task at all. None of these animals kept the bells or sang the psalms, but the abbey's whole self-sufficient life, the plowed fields, the sheared wool, the grain safe from mice in its storeroom, the scriptorium's vellum surviving one more winter untouched, depended on them almost as thoroughly as it depended on any human hand, quietly present in nearly every hour of the day we've spent here, whether anyone paused to notice them or not. An interlude. The masons and the fabric of the house, everything we have walked through today, the dormitory, the night stairs worn smooth, the cold church with its high-painted ceiling, the cloister arcade with frost on its garden, was built by someone, and mostly not by monks. The buildings themselves deserve one last look because the abbey was never actually finished being built at all. A great monastic church took generations to raise. The men who laid its foundations rarely lived to stand under its completed roof. The monk entering the community as a novice might spend his entire life alongside scaffolding at one end of the church or another, the sound of chisels and creaking hoists as constant a background to his prayers as birdsong. The work was directed by a master mason, a layman, highly skilled, often traveling with a core team from project to project, who carried in his head and his rolls of drawings the accumulated structural knowledge of his craft, how to spring an arch, how thick a wall must be to carry a vault, how deep to found a tower in this particular ground. Beneath him worked cutters and setters and laborers, some hired from the region, some lodged for years at a time in workshops against the abbey's outer wall. The stone itself often traveled remarkable distances if the local ground offered nothing good enough, hauled by ox cart or floated by river barge at real expense. One reason building campaigns started and stopped with the abbey's finances, pausing for years when harvests failed or a lawsuit drained the treasury, resuming when a new benefactor's gift arrived. You can still read these pauses today in surviving buildings, as visible seams in the masonry. A change in stone color halfway up a wall, a shift in style between one bay of the church and the next, where work stopped in one generation's fashion and resumed decades later in another's. And once built, everything needed keeping. Lead roofs sprang leaks, gutters and drains on which the whole health of the enclosed buildings depended, clogged and cracked. Glass windows, fabulously expensive, broke. Walls settled and shifted. A dedicated stream of the abbey's income, managed by yet another obedientiary often called the sacrist or a specific keeper of the fabric, existed purely to feed this endless, unglamorous mending. The monastery that looks so permanent and serene in this story stayed that way only through continuous, deliberate repair, a building-sized version of the same patient, repetitive discipline that governed everything else inside it. Nothing about the place simply lasted on its own. It was kept, the way the hours were kept, by unbroken attention. Chapter 5, Sext and the Work of the Pen. The bell for Sext falls at the very center of the day, the sun, on a clear winter afternoon, sitting as high as it will climb before beginning its slow slide back down toward the hills. The name itself simply means sixth, counted from the old Roman start of the working day at dawn, and for 13 centuries this was, quite literally, what most of Europe understood the middle of the day to be called. The office is short. The monks gather, sing, and disperse again. But this time, when we follow, we go indoors, to the room we glimpsed only from a distance in the last chapter, the scriptorium. It is, on a winter day, one of the coldest rooms in the entire complex, and this is not an accident of poor planning but a genuine, unavoidable cost of the work done there. Fire is never permitted near the books. A single stray ember, a single knocked-over lamp, could destroy in minutes what had taken years of careful labor to produce, and in some houses decades of accumulated library alongside it. So the scriptorium goes without a hearth, and the monks who work there in December do so in fingerless gloves, breathing on their hands between lines, sometimes stopping simply to warm their fingers against their own bodies before they can hold a pen steady enough to continue. The materials themselves are extraordinary in a way we hardly notice anymore, precisely because we now take paper so completely for granted. There is no paper here. The writing surface is vellum, calfskin or sheepskin, scraped, stretched, and dried under tension until it becomes a pale, taut, almost translucent sheet, strong enough to be scraped clean and reused if a mistake is made, and durable enough that manuscripts made this way still survive, legible, 900 years later. Preparing it is its own long labor, usually done by monks other than the ones who will eventually write on it. Soaking the hide in lime, scraping away hair and fat with a curved blade, stretching it on a wooden frame, and rubbing the surface smooth with pumice and fine chalk, until it will hold ink without bleeding. The ink is made in-house too, often from oak galls, the strange round growths that form on oak trees where a wasp has laid its eggs, crushed and mixed with iron salts and a binding agent, until it becomes a thin, dark brown-black liquid with one lovely property. It darkens further over time as it dries, so that letters written pale on the page today will look richer and blacker in 100 years than they do on the day they're written. The monks working here understand something about time that most people never have reason to think about, that the object in front of them, right now, is not yet finished becoming what it will eventually be. Before a single word goes down, the page must be ruled, faint parallel lines pressed into the vellum with a hard, empty stylus, guiding where each row of letters will sit, so that even a page of dense, unbroken text ends up perfectly even from top to bottom. Some monks prick tiny holes down the margins first, with a fine awl, as a guide for the ruling lines. And on certain surviving manuscripts, if you know to look for them, those tiny prick marks are still visible along the very edge of the page, a fossil of the exact moment before any writing began at all. And then, finally, the letters themselves, formed one careful stroke at a time in a script whose precise disciplined shapes were themselves partly designed for legibility across centuries, by scribes who in many cases knew they would never see their own work reach the readers it was intended for. Some of the manuscripts in progress on this exact winter afternoon are copies of Scripture. Others are copies of ancient texts, histories, medical treatises, works of philosophy from 1,000 years before this monastery was ever founded, preserved quite simply because someone in a room like this one, at some point in an unbroken chain stretching back centuries, decided it was worth the vellum and the cold fingers to copy it out one more time before the previous copy wore away. In the margins, here and there, something almost playful survives alongside all this discipline. Small painted illustrations, sometimes beautiful, sometimes strange, sometimes in a detail that delights modern readers who stumble on it. Frankly comic, a scribe's private joke tucked into the corner of an otherwise solemn page, a tired hand, a moment of boredom on a long afternoon, and 900 years later someone is still smiling at it. The light in the scriptorium is precious and carefully managed, because good light is the one thing that can't simply be worked around. On the shortest, grayest days of winter, the scribes may only manage a few genuinely productive hours before the light fails, and the fire ban makes it too dangerous to continue by lamp. It is slow work by any modern measure. A single skilled scribe might produce only a few pages in a full day, and it is exactly this slowness, this refusal to rush, that has allowed so much of it to survive intact into an age that would otherwise have had no way of knowing it ever existed at all. An interlude. The library. We have already spent an hour in the scriptorium, watching pages being made, but making a book and reading one were, in this world, two entirely different activities, belonging to two different parts of the day, and it's worth stepping into the second one before the light fails completely. The rule sets aside real time for it. Several hours a day, in fact, adjusted by season, specifically for what the tradition calls lectio divina, sacred reading, a slow and deliberate practice closer to memorization and reflection than to what we'd now call simply reading a book. A monk assigned this time might sit in a quiet corner of the cloister, weather permitting, or in a small chamber near the church, working through a single passage of scripture or a commentary on it with a patience that modern reading habits rarely demand of us, reading a few lines, pausing, turning the phrase over, sometimes moving his lips or murmuring the words softly, because reading in this period was still, for almost everyone, at least partly an act of the voice as much as the eye. The library itself, the physical collection this reading drew from, was usually a modest room near the cloister, sometimes no larger than the scriptorium beside it, with the books themselves stored in wooden chests or on simple shelves rather than displayed. A monk called the armarius, often the same man who oversaw the scriptorium's production, kept charge of the collection, a catalogue, if the house was well organized, listing what was owned and, just as carefully, who currently had which volume signed out, because books of this era were valuable enough that lending one out was treated with the seriousness of lending a considerable sum of money, and what filled these shelves regularly surprises people who assume a monastic library held nothing but scripture. It held a great deal of scripture, certainly, along with the commentaries generations of scholars had written on it, but it held histories too, chronicles of kings and wars, sometimes stretching back to the ancient world. It held medical texts, inherited and copied from Greek and Roman physicians centuries dead, consulted by the infirmarian down the passage when a monk fell ill. It held works on agriculture, on the calculation of the calendar, on grammar and rhetoric for the boys, still learning Latin, and in the better-stocked houses actual pagan philosophy and poetry, writers who had lived and died centuries before Christianity existed at all, preserved here, not because every monk agreed on their value, but because someone, generations earlier, had judged the text worth the vellum, and passed that judgment down the chain to the scribes who kept recopying it. This is, in fact, one of the quieter debts the modern world owes to rooms exactly like this one. A great deal of what survives from the ancient world survives specifically because a monastery somewhere decided a text was worth the enormous cost of copying it by hand, and then did that again, and again, every few generations, as the previous copy wore thin. No single monk in this library today thinks of himself as preserving civilization. He is simply doing his assigned reading, in a quiet corner, in the last of the afternoon light, and it is exactly that unglamorous, repeated, patient labor, done in thousands of rooms like this one, across hundreds of years, that quietly kept so much of the ancient world from disappearing entirely. Chapter 6. None and the One Meal of the Day. The bell for none falls in the mid-afternoon, the 9th hour by the old counting, with the light already beginning its long winter retreat toward evening, and this time, when the community gathers, hunger has become a genuine physical presence in the room, because for most of the year, and especially through the fasting season, this office is quickly followed by the single meal the entire house has been waiting for since the thin bread of early morning. The refectory is a long hall, not unlike the dormitory in shape, with tables running down its length, and near one end a raised wooden pulpit built into the wall. A small stone or wooden staircase leading up to a narrow platform, just large enough for one man to stand. This is where the reader sits, because the meal that follows is eaten in total silence, and into that silence, for the entire duration of the meal, one monk reads aloud, scripture or the life of a saint, or some other approved and edifying text, his voice the only sound in a room otherwise filled with the quiet business of eating. The food itself, in winter, is plain and repetitive by any modern standard, though rarely as harsh as popular imagination sometimes assumes. Bread always, dense, dark, made from the mill's own grain. Vegetables from the garden's cold stores, dried beans, cabbage, whatever roots kept through the frost. fish when the calendar or the season called for abstaining from meat, which in the medieval church was a great deal of the year. A measured allowance of wine or beer, generous enough by later temperance standards but carefully rationed all the same. The rule itself worries, in its own words, about the danger of excess even in something permitted, and sets a modest daily portion rather than leaving the matter to appetite. Because speech is forbidden, the monks have developed something else entirely, to get through a meal together without a word spoken. A working vocabulary of hand signs. Point two fingers toward a loaf, and you're asking for bread. A particular motion of the hand near the mouth, and you're asking for something to drink. Different houses developed their own local variations over the centuries. Entire, small sign vocabularies, numbering into the dozens of gestures at some abbeys, precise enough to request specific foods by name without a single sound. A stranger watching through the door, unfamiliar with the custom, might see 60 grown men eating a completely silent meal while quietly gesturing at one another across the tables, and find the whole scene faintly, endearingly strange. The monks themselves would not have thought it strange at all. It was simply how a meal worked. The meal does not linger. There is no idle conversation to extend it. No reason to sit once the food and the reading are finished. The table's clear. The reader in the pulpit finishes his passage, often, by long custom, cut off mid-sentence by a signal from the abbot, regardless of whether he has reached a natural stopping point, so that no one lingers past the meal's proper end for the sake of narrative curiosity, and the community rises, gives thanks, and disperses once more into whatever remains of the afternoon's work before the light finally fails. Outside, the sky over the fields has already begun to take on the low gold color that, in a few hours, will deepen further still, and somewhere past the orchard wall, the sun is dropping toward the hills faster than anyone at the tables quite noticed while they were eating. An interlude. The sound the bells were calling them to make. We have followed this day almost entirely by its bells, 8 of them marking 8 hours, but we have not yet paused on the sound that filled the church each time the community actually gathered, and it is worth doing so now, because it was unlike almost any music most modern listeners have ever actually heard live. What the monks sang hour after hour was chant, a single unaccompanied melodic line, no harmony beneath it, no instrument supporting it, just voices moving together through a psalm's text at a pace that followed the words themselves, rather than any fixed marching beat. There is no drum here, no strict measured time the way a modern ear expects music to organize itself. The rhythm is the rhythm of speech, stretched and shaped, rising and falling according to old melodic patterns called modes, scales built differently than the major and minor scales that would come to dominate music centuries later, giving chant its distinctive character, at once plain and strange to ears raised on anything else. For much of the earlier medieval period, this music existed nowhere on paper at all. It lived entirely in memory, passed from older monks to younger ones by repetition. The same psalm sung the same way 10,000 times, until it simply became part of a man's body, something he could produce correctly half asleep at 2 in the morning without conscious thought, which, as we saw at Vigils, he very often had to. By the time of the day we're following here, a system of notation had developed and spread widely. Small marks called neumes, written above the words, rising and falling roughly in step with the melody's own shape, a kind of musical shorthand that told a monk who already knew the general tune approximately where it climbed and dropped, though not, in the earliest versions of this notation, the exact pitches themselves. Learning to read it fluently, and learning the melodies precisely enough that the marks were useful rather than merely suggestive, could take years, and fell largely to one man's particular responsibility, the precentor officer of the choir, who trained the community's voices the way the novice master trained its newest members, patiently, repeatedly, correcting a wrong interval here, a rushed phrase there, across a training that effectively never really ended for anyone, no matter how many decades they'd already sung. The building itself was not a passive container for this sound but an active partner in making it. Stone walls, a high vaulted or beamed ceiling, hard floors and almost no soft furnishing anywhere to absorb an echo. A well-built medieval church holds a sound for several full seconds after it's made, the reverberation blurring one note gently into the next in a way that a modern carpeted room, built for speech rather than song, simply cannot reproduce. Chant, sung in a space like this, doesn't so much fill the room as become the room for a while. The last note of one phrase still hanging faintly in the stone as the next phrase begins, layering the voices with the building's own memory of what they just sang. And it was deliberately communal rather than individual. The choir stalls face each other across the width of the church specifically, so the psalms could be sung antiphonally, one side singing a verse, the other side answering with the next, back and forth for the length of an entire psalm, sometimes for an entire hour at Vigils. No single voice was meant to stand out. The boy's higher, unbroken voice and an old man's rough, worn one were meant to disappear into the same collective line. The same unbroken chain of sound the community had been making in this exact building for as long as anyone could remember, and would go on making long after every voice singing tonight had been added in its turn to the necrology's quiet yearly page. Visitors who happened to hear it, a traveling merchant lodged in the guest house, a pilgrim passing on the road at the right hour with the church windows open to the night air, rarely seemed to have forgotten it, a sound that struck many who encountered it as unlike anything else they knew, neither quite of this world, nor entirely apart from it. The monks singing it were rarely thinking in such terms. For them, most nights it was simply the next bell, the next psalm, the same 8 hours turning over again. And it is precisely that unself-conscious repetition, that complete lack of performance, which seems to be what made it to everyone who ever actually stood inside that stone room and heard it so hard to forget. Chapter 7, Vespers, the Golden Hour. Of all 8 bells in the monastic day, Vespers is the one that arrives with the most warmth, in every sense of the word. It falls at evening. The word itself comes from the old term for the evening star, the first point of light to appear as the sky darkens, and the light that fills the church for this office is unlike any other hours, not the thin gray of Vigils, not the pale promise of Lauds, but a genuine deep gold, low and slanting, pouring through the west-facing windows and lying across the stone floor in long amber bars that climb slowly up the far wall as the sun continues its final descent. Generations of monks, across hundreds of houses, chose their psalms for this hour with evident care for exactly this light, verses about thanksgiving, about the day's labor being offered up complete, about rest approaching. Before the office itself, though, there is a task that has quietly claimed part of every single afternoon in this community, and it belongs to a room we haven't yet visited, the infirmary. Every monastery of any size maintained one, a separate building or wing, usually with its own small chapel, its own kitchen for special diets, and its own modest garden of medicinal herbs just outside the door. Sage, rue, fennel, and dozens of others, grown and dried and prepared according to knowledge passed down through generations of infirmarians. Part practical herbalism, and part the accumulated medical learning of the ancient world, copied and recopied in exactly the kind of manuscripts we watched being made a few hours ago. The sick and the very old lived here, cared for with a gentleness the rule insists upon explicitly, in language that still reads 9 centuries later as remarkably tender. The sick, it says, must be served in very deed, as if they were Christ in person. There was another visitor to the infirmary too, on a schedule that had nothing to do with illness at all. Several times a year, by a custom common across many houses, groups of otherwise healthy monks underwent a small, deliberate bloodletting, a widely accepted medical practice of the age, believed to balance the body's humors and preserve health. The monks selected for it were, by long tradition, granted a few days of lighter duties afterward, better food, rest, permission to speak a little more freely than usual, almost a small sanctioned holiday, built into the medical custom itself. It says something quietly human about even the most disciplined of institutions, that they found room inside all that structure for an occasional, officially sanctioned exception. And one more room in this part of the complex deserves a visit while the light turns gold outside. The guest house, standing near the main gate, separate from the enclosed heart of the monastery. The rule is unusually direct on this point. All guests who present themselves, it says, are to be welcomed as Christ himself, because he will say, "I was a stranger, and you took me in." This was not sentiment alone. It was practical necessity in a world with no inns to speak of across most rural stretches of Europe, and monasteries became, almost by default, the closest thing the medieval road system had to a reliable network of shelter. A traveling merchant, a poor pilgrim, an occasional lord passing through with his retinue, all of them might be sleeping under this roof tonight in a guest wing kept separate from the monks' own quarters, but fed from the same kitchens, and warmed, like everyone else in the complex on a cold evening, by the one room built specifically for that purpose. Because there is, finally, warmth to be had here. One room in the entire enclosure permitted an actual fire outside the kitchen and the infirmary, the kale factory, the warming house, a small chamber off the cloister with a real hearth burning, where monks are permitted at certain hours simply to stand near the flames and feel their hands come back to life. It is a small, modest kindness built into an otherwise austere design, and by the time Vespers rings and the community files once more into the church, gold light pouring through the west windows, more than a few of them arrive with fingers still faintly warm from it. The office is sung. The light on the far wall climbs higher, then fades, then is gone, and somewhere beyond the windows, for the second time in this single long day, true darkness begins once again to settle over the fields. An interlude. News from beyond the walls. For all its silence and enclosure, this monastery was never entirely cut off from the wider world turning outside its gates, and the place where that world was allowed to seep in, carefully and under supervision, was a room called the parlor, or the locutorium, the speaking place, one of the only rooms in the entire complex where ordinary conversation was permitted at all. Here, a monk with legitimate business might speak briefly with a visiting relative, a traveling merchant delivering goods, or a messenger carrying letters. Because letters did arrive, from other monasteries in the same order, from the bishop's own household, sometimes from Rome itself, carried by hand across distances that could take these messengers weeks to cross. The well-connected Abbey maintained a real correspondence with the wider institutional church, exchanging news of councils, elections, disputes, and the slow grinding business of ecclesiastical politics that shaped monastic life just as surely as the rule did, even from far away. Visitors in the guest house, too, carried news simply by existing. A traveling lord's retinue might arrive, with fresh word of a war on a distant frontier, a change of kings, a crusade being preached somewhere far to the south. None of it reached the community instantly. The way news travels now, it arrived in fragments, weeks or months old, filtered through whoever happened to be passing the gate that season, and pieced together, gradually, into some rough picture of a world most of these men would spend their entire remaining lives without ever personally seeing again. The abbot, given his own standing and correspondence, often knew considerably more, and considerably sooner than the ordinary choir monk. Another quiet way his day diverged from the community's shared rhythm. Word of a distant council's decisions, a new papal decree affecting how the order should be governed, a dispute over land that might eventually require his own testimony or travel. All of this reached him through channels that never touched the dormitory or the scriptorium at all. For the rest of the community, the outside world remained something felt mostly at a distance, filtered and delayed, present in the letters read quietly in the parlor, in the guest house's occasional traveler, in a passing mention at chapter of some development the abbot thought worth sharing. It was not ignorance exactly. It was simply a different relationship to time and distance than the one governing the news itself. One more way this enclosed life moved to its own patient rhythm, even when the news arriving through its gate concerned kings and wars 1,000 miles away. An interlude, illness, death, and the book of Remembrance. We passed the infirmary once already today, in the golden light before Vespers, and noted its garden of medicinal herbs and its gentler pace. It deserves one more visit, because illness and death were not rare interruptions to monastic life in this period. They were a steady, expected part of its rhythm, and the community had built careful, unhurried customs around both. When a monk fell seriously ill, he was moved to the infirmary and cared for there, often by the infirmarian personally, with a tenderness the rule insists on in unusually direct language. Nothing, it says, should be more important to the community than attending to the sick, since it is truly Christ who is served in them. As death approached, word spread through the house, and the community gathered, not with panic, but with the same unhurried calm that governed every other hour of their day. Prayers were said at the bedside. In many traditions, the dying man was laid at the very end on a bed of ashes or sackcloth on the floor itself, a deliberate, humbling gesture back toward the earth he was returning to. Burial followed quickly, usually within a day, in the monastery's own cemetery, typically a modest plot of ground near the church, sometimes with distinguishing space reserved for the abbot or a particularly significant benefactor to be laid inside the church itself beneath its stone floor. There was no elaborate machinery of mourning in the way later centuries sometimes practiced it. What there was instead was something more permanent. A book. Nearly every monastery of any size kept what is usually called a necrology, or a book of remembrance, a running record organized by the days of the calendar year, listing the death date of every monk who had ever died in that house, along with the death dates of important benefactors, patrons, and friends of the community going back in the older houses for centuries. Each morning at chapter, alongside the reading from the rule, the relevant page for that calendar day was often read aloud. On this day, so many years ago, brother so-and-so departed this life. It meant that a monk who died in this house did not simply vanish from memory once the immediate grief passed. His name returned every single year on the anniversary of his death, read aloud to a room full of men who, in many cases, had never met him at all, because the book outlived any individual monk's memory, and simply kept the appointment on his behalf year after year for as long as the monastery itself continued to exist. It is a strange, quiet kind of immortality, if you sit with it for a moment. Not fame, not a monument, just a name on a page read aloud once a year, forever, by whoever happens to be standing in that chapter house on that particular morning, in whatever century it happens to be. An interlude, a feast day. One thing our single winter day has not shown you is what happened when the calendar itself interrupted the routine, because scattered through the monastic year, like lit windows along a dark road, were the feast days, and the greatest of them transformed this house from top to bottom. Take the greatest of the winter feasts, Christmas. Its approach reshaped the season for weeks in advance through Advent's fasting and anticipation, and its arrival broke over the monastery in the middle of the night, with a vigils unlike any other of the year, longer, fuller, more solemn and more joyful at once, the church lit with far more candles than an ordinary night ever justified, every member of the community present, the chant swelling through additional psalms and readings appointed for the night alone. In many houses a mass was sung at midnight itself, the ancestor of the midnight service half the world still keeps, followed by another at dawn, and another in full daylight. 3 in a single turning of the sun the day transformed the refectory too. Fasting rules relaxed, portions grew, dishes appeared that the ordinary calendar never allowed. Better fish, finer bread, sometimes delicacies given by patrons specifically for the feast, and a more generous measure at the cup. The reader still read, the silence still held, but the meal beneath it was, unmistakably, a celebration. Even the daily labor paused. No digging in the frozen garden on Christmas Day, no long hours over the vellum. The feast claimed the hours that work normally owned, and filled them instead with the liturgy's extra services and with something the rule otherwise rationed carefully: rest. The year held many such lit windows, greater and lesser. Easter above all, arriving at the end of Lent's long austerity like spring itself. Pentecost, the feasts of the apostles, and held with particular warmth, the feast of the house's own patron saint, the Abbey's name day, when the community celebrated the figure whose relics or dedication had anchored the place since its founding, often drawing pilgrims and neighbors through the porter's gate in unusual numbers, the guest house full, the church open to visitors who came especially to be near the shrine. Set against the plainness of the ordinary days, the identical bells, the patched habits, the same psalms in the same order, these feasts did something psychologically shrewd. They made time itself feel inhabited. The year was not a flat sequence of identical days, but a landscape with high ground and low ground, seasons of restraint deliberately arranged so that seasons of joy would actually feel like joy. A monk 40 years into this life did not experience the routine as monotony, or at least was not meant to. He experienced it as a long, familiar road with lights placed along it at known intervals, always another feast somewhere ahead, visible in the distance, drawing the community toward it through the ordinary dark. An interlude, a different season, everything we've followed today, the 2 in the morning bell, the frost on the cloister garden, the aching cold of the scriptorium, the single meal at none, belongs to one particular kind of day, a winter day in the leanest, darkest stretch of the monastic year. Before we follow this house into its final hours, it helps to remember that the same walls held an almost entirely different rhythm just a few months earlier, or a few months later. The rule itself anticipates this and builds the difference directly into its instructions, adjusting the schedule by season rather than pretending one timetable could serve every month equally. In summer, with daylight stretching long past what winter ever offers, Vigils shifts earlier and shorter, time to still leave real darkness afterward, for a proper stretch of sleep before dawn. The single winter meal becomes 2, a midday meal and a lighter supper in the cool of the evening, because the long daylight hours demand more of the body's strength for the heavier outdoor labor summer brings. Haymaking, harvest, the urgent, weather-dependent work that cannot wait for a convenient hour the way a manuscript page can. The scriptorium changes character entirely. The fire ban remains, but there is no need for one in July. Instead, the challenge becomes heat and glare, scribes working in the coolest, most shaded corner they can find, ink drying almost too quickly in the dry summer air rather than refusing to flow in the cold. The gardens, dormant and frozen today, would be at their fullest and most demanding, every hand, not otherwise occupied, pulled toward the harvest at the hours the rule sets aside for manual labor. The calefactory's fire, burning today to thaw cold fingers, would stand cold and unused for months, its one small luxury simply unnecessary, until the frost returns. Even the great silence feels different in summer by the accounts that survive. Warm evening air instead of a rush toward the fire, open windows instead of shuttered ones. The last light of Compline lingering pale in the sky for another hour or more after the office ends, rather than the deep winter dark that has already swallowed the fields by the time this particular day's Vespers began. What stays constant in every season on every single day is the shape underneath all of it, 8 bells, sung in order, never skipped, never rescheduled for convenience. The same 8 names in the same 8 hours, whether the fields outside are frozen solid or heavy with ripening grain. The content of the hours shifts with the sun, the hours themselves do not. That, more than anything else we've followed today, is the real discipline this life asks for. Not the cold, which passes, and not the heat, which passes too, but the unbroken, unhurried return to the same 8 moments, year after year, season after season, for as long as the bell keeps being rung. Chapter 8. Compline and the Great Silence. The 8th and final bell of the day comes softly, almost apologetically, once true dark has fully settled outside. Compline, whose name simply means completion, and whose entire character, after everything that has come before, is one of gentle closing. The psalms chosen for this last office are, across nearly every tradition that has come down to us, quieter and more personal than any of the day's other 7. Verses about lying down in peace, about trust in the darkness, about a soul settling the way a tired body settles into a bed at the end of a long day. There is, in many houses, a final blessing, and then a hymn sung to close the day, its melody soft enough that a traveler who happened to hear it drifting from a monastery's windows at night might carry the memory of it for the rest of the road. And then, the moment the last note fades, silence begins. Not the ordinary daytime silence observed during work and meals, which permits necessary words and practical signs, but something stricter, the great silence running from this exact moment until the bell for vigils calls the community awake again in the deep hours of the coming night. No speech at all, for any reason short of genuine emergency, no signs even beyond what is absolutely necessary. The entire monastery, every person inside its walls, simply stops making sound together at the same moment and does not begin again until the whole cycle we have followed today starts over. The monks return once more to the dormitory, the same long room, the same narrow beds, the same 2 small lamps burning at either end, never quite extinguished, never quite bright enough to read by, just enough to keep the room from total darkness. They lie down in the same habits they have worn since before dawn, belts still fastened, ready, as they have been every night of their lives in this house, for the bell that will find them again in a few short hours, and ask them to rise into the cold one more time. Outside, the frost is already thickening on the cloister garden, on the fishpond ice, on the mill wheel standing motionless now that the day's grinding is done. The scriptorium sits dark and empty, its unfinished pages exactly where the scribes left them, waiting for tomorrow's brief hours of usable light. The infirmary's small fire has been banked low for the night. The guest house holds its handful of travelers, strangers this morning, strangers again tomorrow, sheltered for one night inside walls that have sheltered strangers just like them for centuries before, and would go on doing so for centuries afterward. And somewhere above all of it, in a dark room at the top of a set of stairs worn smooth by 10,000 nights just like this one, 30 or 60 or 100 men lie still, breathing slowly, drifting toward whatever comes before the bell finds them. It will come, as it always does, a little past midnight. It will ask them to rise into the cold and sing, and they will. Sleep well. Somewhere tonight that bell is still ringing.